Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Kim Scott, co-founder of Radical Candor and author of the books Radical Candor and Just Work.
I'm Jason Rosoff, CEO and co-founder of Radical Candor.
And I'm Amy Sandler, your host for the Radical Candor podcast. And today we're talking about how to practice radical candor in a multi-generational workplace when clear communication isn't happening and maybe generational traits aren't translating. We're going to explore more, starting with a listener's question and just noting that this is a listener, a female listener who works in law enforcement. So they write, "Hi there. I have a direct report who's the same age as my dad, 71.
I'm going to interrupt you right there.
I knew I wasn't going to even get out of the gate.
So we're going to come back to this. I don't want to talk endlessly about it, but as soon as someone reminds you of someone with whom you have an intimate relationship, you're in a danger zone. I'm just going to state that. Okay, keep going.
All right.
Sorry.
Direct report, same age as my dad, 71. And given the phase that he's in his life, I wouldn't put him in the growth quadrant, referring to the radical candor growth quadrant.
So I'm gonna interrupt you again. Make sure that you separate performance and growth. Like they're two different things. Okay, keep going.
Okay. Personally, he's a nice person, has a good heart, but has trust issues with female authority figures. My predecessor was also female, although she was only about 10 years younger than him, and he had issues with her and does not trust management despite being a manager himself.
I have no interruption. Keep going.
I'm like waiting for the shoe to drop. And I continue. Quote, his intentions are good. He cares personally for his direct reports. However, it's to the detriment of the organization or not in the best interest of the organization. His performance, if I'm being honest, is poor. And I put him in the poor performance, no signs of improvement quadrant. So this was a direct link, Kim, to your work there.
Right.
He falls asleep in meetings. Colleagues
okay. I think this is where we're going to start. This is falling asleep in meetings is not okay.
Okay. And colleagues often approach me about it. I've spoken to him about looking after his health. However, he has this mindset that, quote, if I retire, I will fall off the perch. That's because most of his friends have passed shortly after retiring. I feel his motivation to come to work is that it's something to do and also part of his routine. However, I don't believe he's performing at his level, nor should he be working full-time. Every time I approach this topic with him, he gets defensive, another example of trust issues, and thinks I want him to...
Stop there. Let's go back. I have a question about... I'm not questioning that he has trust issues, and I'm not questioning the other stuff, but I'm wondering if this is a good example of a trust issue. So let's come back to that too.
Gotcha. I'll restate the sentence. Every time I approach this topic with him, he gets defensive, another example of trust issues, question mark from Kim, and thinks I want him to retire despite my saying there's so many options we can consider, such as reduced workload, part-time, etc. Can you please advise alternative methods of approaching this situation? So that is the end of the letter. Kim, shall I continue or do you have something burning?
No, continue.
Okay. So I think what's interesting, in addition to, Kim, the flags you were noting around the framing of the question, is that there's a part of this question that's coming around generational differences and also different expectations based on gender that may be a result of these generational differences. How much weight should we give to this idea of a multi-generational workplace and how different generations might be approaching different situations? How much is helpful and how much of that is actually just putting people into boxes?
So can we talk about, I think that's an important question. Can we talk about that sort of later in the conversation?
We can.
I want to add one thing for us to come back to. I'm not sure exactly when we're going to get to it, but I want my reaction after hearing you read it, Amy. Actually, I read it several times, but after hearing you read it, I had this reaction that I didn't have while reading it on my own, which is that this person has basically told the older person has told their manager that from their perspective, this is a life and death situation.
Yes.
If I retire, I will fall off.
I'm going to die.
Yeah.
Like that. I actually feel like I don't know why it didn't strike me, but as I was hearing, maybe it's just like hearing someone else say it, it made me feel a bit more empathetic than the sort of cold words on the page. But it struck me so differently that that fear is so deeply rooted in what it means to be human.
Yeah.
And there might be a generational difference, but the age difference, that the facing one's own mortality thing that happens as we age, like I feel it feels very raw actually in hearing you read it in a way that it felt very sort of perfunctory when I was reading it on my own.
Oh, that's really interesting, because when I read it, the first thing I did was the first thing that this that the person who wrote in did is I read an intimate relationship of my own, and it immediately started me thinking about my grandfather. And I remember when he started talking about retiring, which he had to do because he was a surgeon and his hand had started to tremble pretty dramatically. So it was obvious to him and to everyone else but he said so often, as soon as I retire, I will die. And I remember feeling so afraid for him. And so as a result, I was immediately thinking of this person who the person who wrote in is having trouble managing. So I want to acknowledge that it's like the most natural thing in the world to sort of read your own experiences into these things, and it can get you into trouble. But I think where I would like to start, with your all's permission, is the falling asleep in meetings thing.
Yeah,
because I think that is an obvious performance problem. And it's something that I have seen all kinds of different people do for all kinds of different reasons. Young people can fall asleep in meetings. Old people can fall asleep in meetings. Like all different kinds of people fall asleep in meetings. And I think we can agree that it's not okay to fall asleep in a meeting, right?
Yep.
Like it's pretty disruptive and disrespectful. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it's fair. I think, Kim, what's going through my mind is just like the frame on the conversation, which is about when something is poor performance and when something is life or death. What's on my mind is when you say young people can fall asleep in meetings, it's sort of how much of the performance issue is related to actually this person's overall health and well-being, and how much of it is related to their ability to stay sort of present or alert in a meeting.
Well, I don't know. We don't know. I mean,
Right.
In my experience, and this is not necessarily everyone's experience, and I don't mean to read myself into the story, but in my experience, when the people who I have managed who've fallen asleep in meetings are often young people, because I worked in tech. I was the old person.
Yep.
And they were usually falling asleep because they weren't getting enough sleep.
Yep.
And that's a health issue. And I think it is, I notice with extremely young, like my kids' friends who are teenagers, like extremely young people, they often are really sleep deprived.
Yep.
And then they fall asleep in moments when they shouldn't fall asleep, or they lose focus in moments when they shouldn't lose focus. So there's a bunch of different reasons. I mean, maybe this guy is, like my 14-year-old children, addicted to social media, and that's why he's falling asleep, not because he's 71.
And I think that's the point, Kim. I think that's why you wanted to start there, because in hearing the way that this person is thinking through this situation, they're trying very hard to sort of play armchair psychologist and figure out why certain things are happening or why this person is behaving in a particular way, as opposed to talking clearly about the issues that need to be resolved. And I think if you're going to have a conversation with someone, especially someone that you have a lot of differences with, I think it's really important to find the areas where there's where the problem can be clearly stated without immediately going to why that problem is occurring.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And so I think the place to start is, I mean, because there are other issues that need to be addressed. Like it sounds like another problem, a separate problem, is that the person who wrote in feels that this man doesn't respect her authority. And that's an issue
Mhm.
that also that's hard for her, and it needs to be addressed. But I think the place to start is simply by asking, you're falling asleep often in meetings. What's going on? This doesn't seem, because presumably the person knows it's not okay to fall asleep in meetings.
So can we do an actual role play of that? I'm just curious, just because I find that could be an interesting way to see how you might respond. Kim, would you like to give it a go?
Yeah. Who's?
I think
who's
I would
the-
like you to be the person writing in, and Jason, if you wouldn't mind being the person falling asleep. How does that work for you?
I am feeling afraid that I am going to fall victim to stereotyping. So I am
Yeah.
going to try. I am going to try quite hard.
Do you want me to be? We can switch roles if you want, Jason.
I don't. I'm okay. I'm just.
Do you think just the
sharing.
situation itself? Well, that was I think that was Kim's concern, even with the generational framing, is that it can fall prey to stereotyping. So, is there any way that doing a role play of this would not fall prey to stereotyping, or do you think inherently we don't have enough information to give it a helpful go?
I think we can try it.
Okay, I'll give it a shot. Let's see
But
how it
I'm
goes.
happy-
And
why
you all can tell me.
Why don't I be the older man?
Sure, let's try it.
Okay. Do we need the action?
Yeah, action.
Action.
Hey, Kim, I appreciate you making some time to chat with me. How are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm really good. How you doing?
You know, I'm doing well, and I'm glad to hear you say that you're doing well, because I wanted to check in on something that I've noticed happen a couple of times over the last few weeks. I've noticed that you've fallen asleep in meetings a few times. I was just curious to understand what was going on there.
I don't think it's any big deal. I mean, everybody falls asleep in meetings, don't they? I mean, we're all like 24/7. It's a intense period for all of us, and I've noticed a lot of people feeling really especially the young people these days. They're up all night watching Netflix, like doing God knows what on social media. Nobody is getting enough sleep these days. It's another epidemic.
Yes, and I want to acknowledge that sleep is really important for everybody, and I also want to acknowledge that my observation is that not everybody is falling asleep in meetings. That it has
I've
happened a
seen
few
you.
times.
You look tired. In fact, are you okay? You got some bags under your eyes today.
I thank you for noticing my bags. Yeah, I am tired, but I did manage to stay awake in all of my meetings today. And that's the thing that I'm trying to get at is people do have to come to work tired. There's no way around that. But the meetings that we hold are important, and your attention in those meetings is important. And not only
I gotta say, management is making me spend too much time in meetings, and they are boring. They are not important. They are boring as hell.
and
Do you think you could spice the meetings up a little bit? That would help a lot.
I want to find a way to figure out how to keep you awake in meetings, but I don't think it is a fair thing to ask for us to spice the meetings up, because not every meeting can be super exciting. What I want to figure out, what I'd love to hear from you,
They used to be.
All right.
back in your day.
Should we put a pause here?
Yeah.
There's a back in my day subtext to all of that.
Jason, I think you did a really good job. And
I do too.
I'm going to say that I think I did a pretty good job making your life hell.
You did a great job, Kim.
I was really enjoying it. That's the kind of conversation where my mind is like, what is a way in?
What's
like,
a way in?
Where is is there just a chip in the defenses that we can explore to see if there's a way in? And sometimes there's not. Like one of the things that I like about stopping the role play there is that sometimes feedback conversations like that really don't go anywhere. But that doesn't mean that doesn't mean they had no effect. I think that's,
and it doesn't mean you did a bad job. It means that I'm defensive because I believe I'm protecting my life. And that's why I was being so defensive I was afraid that you were going to tell me I had to retire, and I was afraid that I would die if I retire. And therefore I'm throwing up every defense, even if I'd rather you think I'm an asshole than die.
Right.
And so that was kind of,
which seems fair.
Yeah. what is Jason's next step after a conversation like this, where there may have been some progress in the sense of you were explaining, you're being very clear, but what is the follow-up? What is the next step to a conversation where you seem to be butting heads?
Well, if the conversation would have continued, I was about to throw in the towel, not like completely, but rhetorically, and say, "Hey, I don't feel like I'm getting anywhere. Like I feel like we're at an impasse in this conversation, and I want to understand why. Why do we see this
Yeah.
so differently? Help me understand what's going on, because I feel like I have an obligation as a manager to make my expectation clear. As we said before we got into the role play, I think everybody agrees in practice. So, like, another rhetorical approach might have been to say, well, how do you feel when other people fall asleep in the meetings that you're leading? Like, what does that signal to you about
Yeah.
how they feel about you or your work? But that's where I was going next, was to say, like,
Mhm.
okay, we can't agree on something that seems very simple, which is that people should not be unconscious in the meetings that we're holding on a regular basis. So now let's peel the onion and see what might be underneath that resistance.
I think that would have been, but what was on my mind? Because as I was doing that, I was imagining what I would do if I were in your shoes, Jason. And what I was thinking I might do, and I was debating in my head, like, would this be a bad idea? Would this be a good idea? So I'm curious for y'all's thoughts. But one thing you could do is say, okay, I'm gonna track the number of times you fall asleep in meetings, and I want you to track the number of times I fall asleep. Like, let's
Let's
get
get
some
some data.
data. Yeah, let's
Yeah.
get some data, because sometimes, but I think your approach would be better, because now all of a sudden you're kind of, rather than slamming me with data, you're getting on the same side of the table with me and sort of trying to understand what's going on.
One of the things that I appreciated about being involved in that role play directly was how frustrated the person who wrote in might feel.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. This is, I mean, when I started as I think I've mentioned before, like, I went in 1 week from being the youngest to being the oldest person in the room, and it's both are hard. Uh,
Yeah.
but I would say it's harder to be the youngest person, to be younger than your direct reports, than it is to be older than your direct reports. And it's also hard when you're managing a person who's older than you and who grew up in a time when women were very, very rarely, if ever, leaders. And so
Hmm.
it's hard for both sides, but I think, you know, having been on the woman side of that equation, I would say maybe it's harder. But I don't know. I mean, I often talk to my father, who was a man of this man's generation and who was suddenly working for women. And that has its. I'm compassionate for those sets of challenges as well. I mean, I think he did okay, but he sometimes really screwed up, and he was puzzled and upset at the ways that he screwed up. And he would call me and describe something that happened, and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, Dad, did you don't you understand why that was a huge problem?" And he was bewildered, and it was hard for me, who was on his side, to explain to him why it was such a problem in some of his behavior.
Yeah.
Kim, I'm curious, given your personal experience on that, is there a way to kind of translate that for other folks? I mean, while we don't want to be putting people in boxes, acknowledging that the generational differences, especially around, in this case, gender, but I'm sure other underrepresented groups, where one group is not used to seeing this group in a position of responsibility and what might come up. Is there an example of the kind of responses that you saw from your dad, and what you felt might be helpful, to share with this listener?
Yeah, I think that one of shortly after Radical Candor came out, I got a note on, I think, LinkedIn, from somebody who said that it was not a generational thing, but he said that he had grown up in a society where women were almost never leaders or even at work. And that now he was here in the United States, and he had a woman who was a boss, and he said, "Can you tell me how to deal with this?" And I did not take one of my many mistakes in life. I did not take that question as seriously as I should have. One thing that I wish I had said to this guy who wrote me the question, and also to my dad, is like, this must be strange for you. Don't accept that it's unacceptable, but this must be hard for you. What could I do that would make it easier? I think there's kind of an elephant in the room between these two people, between this manager and her direct report. And I think the more you can just sort of talk about it openly, the easier it's pretending that it's not an issue is a problem. The other thing that I would say is, don't say you don't seem to respect women leaders. Like it's almost impossible to imagine a scenario in which you would say, yeah, you're right, I don't. And if he did, like, then you got a whole other set of problems on your hand. So I would start sort of by trying to get on the same side of the table with this guy and saying, look, it must be hard to be managed by someone who's younger, and I have a lot to learn from you. And one of the most important things I could learn from you is what I could do to be a better leader. Like, I think and this goes back to being, sort of confidently humble. Not humiliated humble, but confidently humble, to have the confidence to just talk about this. And by the way, I did that. At one point, when I started Juice, I co-founded the company with a man who was, I don't know, not much older. He was about a decade older than I was. And he had he was the CTO and co-founder. He had tons, it was a software company. He had tons of experience. He understood, you know, software. And I had studied Russian literature. Like, so not only was I younger and a woman, I was not technical. And so there were a bunch of reasons why he might not respect my leadership. And, I was now imposing all these reasons on him. Yeah. And I realized that I needed to I needed not to prejudge how he was going to respond to me. So I said it point blank. I said, there's something that's awkward about me being the CEO and you being the CTO. And I just want to put that on the table, and let's talk together about how we can make this work.
Kim, how did that conversation go?
It was great. I mean, he was relieved. I was relieved. He told me all the reasons, actually, why he was glad that he was not the CEO, and that I was doing all the junk that he didn't want to do. And we worked very well together. We're still friends, So I think it was a good conversation. And I found, and there was another time in my career when I was working for someone, and that person said, the tables could easily be turned here. I could be working for you, so let's figure out how to make this work. I think that is really useful conversation to have. But I don't think that's where this person needs to start. I think this person needs to start with falling asleep in meetings is not okay. And the reason why I said and then I did what I said one shouldn't do, because we all do it, is whenever you're sort of reading an intimate relationship into a work relationship, that it's dangerous, because it's possible that this listener's father, who's 71, is going gangbusters in his career, or he's totally retired and happily retired. And you don't want to read either one of those situations into this. You don't want to read what's going on for this person's father just because he's older and about the same age and a man as this direct report. Doesn't mean that the direct report has any of the same characteristics as this listener's father. I'll give you another example. Sorry, Jason, I interrupted you.
I wanted to say that I noticed a pattern in the recommendations that we're making. And I think the pattern is that when we notice resistance and we don't fully understand why we're getting resistance, the goal is to try to find the underlying reason and to talk about that. So if you were worried about how your background and experience you did this proactively, but if you're the manager, you can also do this reactively. But you said to your CTO, let's have a conversation. Here are the things that I'm worried that because of these characteristics, it's going to make it harder for me to be CEO, or it's make it harder for you to trust or respect the my judgment or the way that I'm approaching things. And by exposing that, you made it possible to sort of build a bridge over it, to put it, or to not put it behind you necessarily, but to acknowledge it and hopefully move past it.
Yeah, I mean, you can't get the elephant out of the room if you're pretending the elephant's not in the room, and that was sort of what I was trying to do there.
Exactly. And I think that when I go back to reading what this person wrote, the way that they wrote it, and they may not have intended this, immediately after they quote the person as saying, "If I retire, I'll fall off the perch," their response is, "I feel his motivation to come to work is to have something to do." But that's not what he said. What he said is, "I'm coming to work to stay alive."
Yeah. Yeah.
Not to have something to do. It's not just like a nice to have. It's not just something to do. It's literally like, from my perspective, it's one or the other. It's like I come to work or I fall off the perch. It's like that's how serious it is to him. And I think there's an opportunity here to acknowledge and to really hear that, to say, I hear you.
Yeah.
Like I hear you saying that you are afraid that if this happens, you're going to die. And I don't want that for you. I want to find a solution to that problem. But maybe acknowledging it might go some distance to starting create some space to resolve
Jason, just as you say that, the other thing on my mind, I don't know if these are related. There was the falling asleep in meetings piece of it. There was the elephant in the room piece, Kim, that you've been talking about. And then there's the life or death implications that you're talking about. There's also this idea of his performance, if I'm being honest, is poor, and I put him in the poor performance. So I'm not sure how much of that is the falling asleep or if there's other metrics. So I'm curious, given all of these pieces and threads, Kim, you wanted to start with falling asleep, but how do you have the poor performance conversation? How do you have the life or death conversation, given that these multiple touch points?
Yeah, so I guess I would recommend, I mean, given what we know from this note, which is admittedly we don't know that much, so this advice could be wrong, but I think I would take a step back and I would take this person out of the poor performance, no signs of improvement quadrant, because that means, unless there's other things that we don't know, which there probably are, but if this listener thinks this person is in the poor performance, no signs improvement quadrant, that means that she should be managing this person out.
Right.
And I don't think falling asleep in meetings, while it's a problem, you want to give someone feedback about that particular problem and give them a chance to fix the problem before you manage them out. Now, there may be other things, other reasons why this person does need to be managed out. And if that's the case, then you need to have a very clear conversation. But I think that if this employee can quit falling asleep in meetings and can perform well, you want to keep this employee, I would assume. So that's, Amy, I think you're touching on a really, really important point.
Yeah, I think getting really clear on, is this person in really more of the kind of stability mode and able to meet the demands of the job, or are they in the poor performance and, like you said, Kim, needing to be managed out? Jason, how would you unpack those? Kim, are you saying modes on those versus?
Yeah, I mean, nobody is a terrible, so terrible that they should never. Well, I shouldn't say nobody, but almost nobody is so terrible that they should never have any job. But if this person is performing so badly and is unwilling to improve, then they do need to be managed out. But if the only evidence of poor performance, no signs of improvement, is falling asleep in meetings, then I think it would be useful, if you want to try to retain this employee, to sit down and talk about the falling asleep, ask questions about why they're falling asleep, and see if you can fix that. If there's that problem and 30 other problems that this listener didn't have time to write in this note, then you need to sit down and talk about all 30 problems.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, That's what's on my mind. Like what is, let's just pretend, for instance, that this person has told you this is life or death. If I retire, I'm going to fall off the perch. And it's not just about falling asleep. There are multiple performance issues. What,
Yeah.
Jason, you're nodding. What is that? That's a different challenging conversation.
Absolutely, it is different and challenging, but I still think you owe it to the person to be clear about what those things are. To say, like, before, part of what I heard Kim saying earlier is, if this person, the way that the note is written is that they have not arrived at the judgment, at the decision that this person needs to be managed out, that they think there's some way to either modify the person's job or something else in order to retain the person. And from that perspective, I think Kim is exactly right. You talk through the performance issues, make sure there isn't a way to address them in order to keep the job as it currently is. And once you've done that, then I think you say, okay, here's the plan. Like, based on our conversation, you can do these things, but you can't do these things. And so this is what we're going to modify the role. The role is going to look like this. Is that something that you're interested in? But I think without going through the things that are going wrong, you haven't upheld your obligation as a manager to at least give the person an opportunity to improve. Because they may not see those things as performance problems. Going back to someone having a lot of experience, being a long time on the job, maybe this person is doing things the way that their manager taught them to do it. You know what I'm saying? Like, you don't, maybe they think they're performing fine. Maybe the things that you're looking at, you're saying, oh, this person isn't giving that person, sounds like there's some issues. There's some hand waving done at the very beginning of the note about issues with their direct reports. But from that person's perspective, unless you've told them specifically what is wrong with the way they're managing people, they may be under the assumption that they're doing a good job. There's a judgment underneath that this person is aware that they're doing a bad job and they just don't care. And I think that's the thing that you have to dispel by being really clear as, like, here are the things that I see as issues. And I want to talk to you about each of them so we can figure out if there's a way to keep you in the current job or if you have to do something different.
I also want to say for this listener who wrote in, like, your job is to hold this employee accountable for doing a good job. Your job is not to keep this person alive. I mean, when you hear something like that, I mean, it's good that this employee has made himself so vulnerable, but I also don't want this listener to fall prey to ruinous empathy.
Yep.
To say, just because the person said that, shared their fear with you, doesn't mean that you have to leave them in their job forever.
Right.
Your job is to hold them accountable, and you want to stay present with that fear. But I mean, I will say, again, not, this person is not my grandfather, but my grandfather did not die when he retired. He lived many years and very happily, and got into woodworking, and I still have some of the things he made and here with me. So there's all kinds of, but it's not your job to figure out retirement for this guy, but it is your job to remain compassionate with the fear that this person has.
So can I ask you all to do one more role play?
Yeah.
So I want to call out, just Kim, what you're naming, and from going back to the listener's note, I don't believe he is performing at his level, nor should he be working full time. Then she says, every time I approach this topic with him, he gets defensive, thinks I want him to retire, despite my saying there's so many options we can consider, such as reduced workload, part-time, etc. So the role play I would love to hear is this idea of, I don't think you should be working full time, and the other person saying, you want me to retire, and whatever that.
I think it's premature for this person who's writing in to say you shouldn't be working full time.
I agree.
I think that, and there may or may not be some element of reading her father's situation into this other man's situation. I mean, I will say, whenever I've worked for someone and they start out saying, you remind me of my daughter, I feel like, oh, damn, what's going to happen now, And so I mean, sometimes that's, usually they mean it as, I love my daughter, so obviously I'm caring about you, but often they're they're bringing all kinds of other baggage from their relationship with their daughter into their relationship with me, and I don't want that baggage.
Yep.
So I think that it's premature for this person to tell her direct report he needs to start working part-time. I think what she needs to do is make a list of the performance issues. It's okay that he doesn't want to grow, but what are the performance issues? Falling asleep is one. My hunch is, given this note, there's probably 10 or 15 others. Make a list of those performance issues and address those with the person, and then work with the person to figure out if they can, what the best way for them to address the performance issues is.
Really well said. I'll only add that I feel like this person is sort of caught between ruinous empathy, manipulative insincerity, and potentially like accidental obnoxious aggression. Like they're trapped in the mistake quadrants. And
Yeah.
And it makes
Which
sense.
we all are. It's not a
Right,
condemnation of this person writing in.
Exactly what I was going to say. It makes perfect sense in this situation to feel like to bounce between those quadrants, because on the one hand, you're very frustrated at this person's performance, and they may be hurting other people's potential to grow by not managing them correct. Like there's lots of reasons potentially to be frustrated with what's going on. And that leads to the maybe jumping to conclusions, which can come across as sort of obnoxious aggression, right? Like you should be working part-time.
Yeah.
Probably comes across as like a swipe at this person, as opposed to an act of generosity trying to get them to find a way to get them to stay. And the same thing with avoiding talking about certain things, like avoiding being really clear, like here are the 15 performance issues that I've observed, and this is why I considering some sort of different duty, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's a way to address these performance issues. But you owe it to that person to be clear to them, to not hold that information back, to Kim's point, because you're afraid that they're going to react poorly to it, or because you're afraid that they're going to take it as another attempt to get them to retire. Like you still owe it to them. That's what, at least if you're going to be a radically candid manager, that's the obligation that you have to that person. So as I was thinking about what I wanted to recommend to the person who wrote in, I just want to acknowledge that it's really hard work. Like the thing that we're describing is incredibly hard to do. It's hard to do under the best of circumstances when you have someone who is otherwise a great performer who falls off the rails and you're hoping to be able to get them back on. So like, let's say you had a great relationship with this person, their performance takes a nosedive. That is difficult to deal with. But you have your relationship is struggling, like you're struggling to have a good relationship with this person. Their performance is poor and has been poor. Like you've never seen them do really great work. And there's some generational or non-generational misogyny potentially, like in the way that they're treating you because you're a woman. This is really hard. Like it is really, really difficult. And so we're describing the best case scenario when we say this is what, if you want to uphold the principles of radical candor, like this is what your obligation looks like. But we're not saying it's free. I think it's really important to say it's not free.
Yeah, it's not. It's hard work. Amy, I want to honor your request. I think what Jason and I could do is a role play where one of us tells the other, we go back to the issue of falling asleep in meetings, and then the direct report says, are you trying to knock me off my perch? I'm going to die. That is hard because now all of a sudden this person has given voice to their ultimate fear. And what you're saying is stop falling asleep in meetings, right? And so how can you remain present for that strong emotion without backing off your insistence that they should not be falling asleep in meetings?
I think that's a great idea, especially since what Jason was saying, that if this person, this is hard and the tendency is going to be to move between ruinous empathy, manipulative insincerity, obnoxious aggression, etc. So would you like to keep the same roles or would you like to switch?
I kind of think we should switch. I don't know. What do you think, Jason?
Let's
you want to switch?
All
okay.
Right. So just to remind us all who's who here.
So I'm the writer and Jason is the 71-year-old.
Okay. And Jason's going to do the line around falling off his perch and we'll see how you respond.
I'll figure out a way to, are we picking up in the middle of our last conversation?
No, let's imagine
sort of take two on the sleeping.
Yeah.
Hey, Jason, thanks so much for getting together to talk about this again. I know it was kind of a hard conversation last time, but I really do want to address this issue of falling asleep because I know you care about this group of people, and I know that you you don't want to be I assume you don't want to be disrespectful to your colleagues. And so I really want to talk about it.
Yeah, Kim, thanks. I recognize that in our last conversation, maybe I was a little bit glib, but it's really important to me that I continue to work. This job is really important to me. I've spent a lot of time at it. I want to continue to do it.
I'm really glad to hear that because I want you to continue to do it, and if you're going to continue to do a great job, we gotta figure out what's going on with you falling asleep.
Yeah. Sometimes when we have these conversations, I think it's easy because you're so young not to imagine what it's like to be my age and in this job. But I'm 71 years old. In the last 10 years, I've lost a lot of friends who they retire and they just don't have anything. They don't have anything left to keep them excited, and they die. I've lost friends after retirement, and I'm really nervous that in addition to doing the job, like I'm really nervous that if I stop, that's going to be it for me.
I'm really sorry to hear about your friends. I can't imagine. You're right. I can't imagine what that's like. But I'm sure that it is unbearably hard. And I want you to keep working. Everybody appreciates that you have a good heart, that you have a lot of experience, that we can all learn a lot from you. And I think the best thing you can do to stay in this job is to figure out what's going on, what's making you fall asleep in meetings, and figure out how to stop falling asleep in meetings. Do you think that is something that you can do?
I hear you saying that, and at the same time, I look around and I notice that other folks who have been in the job as long as I have, they're all getting pushed out. So it's hard to believe that that's really all this is about. Is that is a simple performance issue. It's easy for me to imagine that what you're really saying is, I'm putting this on your record so that I have a reason to let you go.
I hear you. I hear what you're saying. I want to assure you that we do not have a policy of pushing people out when they're older. And so, I can't talk about specific people for privacy reasons, but I want to assure you that I am not trying to push you out and that we have the same goal, which is to keep you in. And the best way to keep you in is to figure out what's happening when you're falling asleep. So, why don't we say this? I'm not going to put this in any kind of official record, but I want you to go and figure out what you can do so that you're not going to fall asleep in meetings. And I will, with your permission, keep track of the number of times you do fall asleep so that you're aware of it, so that we're not pretending, because I don't want to pretend it's not happening. Like the fastest path to having to leave the job is not to perform in the job. And this falling asleep is a big performance problem that you have, and I want you to fix it. I think it's probably fixable, but not if we pretend like it's not happening.
All right, Kim. Thanks. I can do that.
All right, and scene.
That was great. I have to say, Jason, what you said was such a great pushback around sort of this is the pattern and you're pushing me out. And then Kim, I thought you did such a had such a deft way of acknowledging what he was saying, but also saying we can't ignore it. And if, again, we don't know all of the performance issues that might be happening beyond the falling asleep, but if we just sort of use that as performance issue A, B, C, D, you were very clear about we have to name this, we have to track it, we can't pretend it's not happening.
And I'll just say, as like being in it, I really did feel the sincerity. Like it felt sincere when you said, "I'm like I want to be on your team, but to be on your team, we have like there's some things we have to agree to change."
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
And I think that sort of honesty is like it's your only chance in a situation like this. That sort of like commitment, not to abstractly keeping someone in the job, but to saying this is a step on the path to keeping you in the job, is addressing this issue. This is how we get on the same. This is how we be on the same team.
Yeah.
Like I thought that was very effective.
I think that's such a great takeaway. I mean, it's interesting. We talk about being the importance of specificity, especially with praise, being specific and sincere. But Jason, to your point, you felt the care personally came through by Kim being clear and specific about what the next step was.
Yeah, and I even if I left that conversation and I still wasn't convinced that Kim was being entirely honest with me, after that conversation, it'd be harder to convince myself that she was actively trying to deceive me. That could be the elephant in the room, is like, maybe, that this person's baggage may be well earned with their previous
Yeah.
manager. And it may have nothing to do with the fact that they were a woman. Maybe maybe there's other things going on. And my guess is that it's probably rare that that kind of directness, that kind of clarity occurs. I mean, it's rare in any workplace that I've ever worked in. So even though it's anecdotal, I feel like I have enough years to know that it's rare to get that kind of clear guidance from somebody else.
What did you all think of my commitment not to putting the falling asleep in any kind of record right away? I mean, that was a risk. I was like, I was, because you do. I did say I was going to track it, but I'm going to keep this between you and me for a while and give you a chance to fix the problem without putting it into your record.
Given all the rest of the history, I think that is the only. I heard the risk as you were saying it, and I was like, I don't know. I can't think of a better way to approach it. And the reason why is, like, documenting it is only going to be there at this point, is only really going to be there to cover your ass later.
Yeah.
To say, like, I knew about this and I documented it. It's not going to fix it. It's not going to help your relationship. It's not going to increase the chances that the person performs better. I think it was a calculated risk, but one that I probably would have taken also.
Yeah, I won't speak to like the HR legal part, but I will say specifically to what the listener wrote in multiple times about trust. I mean, to me, that's a real trust builder, that you're sharing this information to help them get better. Like, that to me amplifies what Jason was saying, which is, I feel like you're saying this to help me get better, not to, quote, push me out. To me, it was a direct response to him saying, people have been pushed out.
Yeah. This also raises another issue, which is that the core of Radical Candor is about these impromptu conversations, and that are meant to help a person develop. And that's different from a formal performance management system. And I think it's really important that you build trust with these informal conversations, and that you have a bunch of those conversations before you start putting things in these formal systems, because there is so much mistrust for the formal systems. And if you allow that formal system to get in between you and the relationship that you're forming with this person, it's all over.
So we started this conversation with a frame around generational differences. How do we manage a multi-generational workplace? We kind of touched on it. Our conversation went in a different direction, which we always appreciate the agility and the value of having these conversations in the role play, is really seeing what really happens. And what we discovered was that there's a lot under the surface here of what we bring into these conversations, even if we are not always conscious of that. So just want to say we will be following up with some more content around multi-generational workplaces. But in the meantime, we're going to move us on to our Radical Candor checklist. We want you to have tips to use to start putting Radical Candor into practice.
Tip number 1, name the elephant in the room. If you refuse to acknowledge that it's there, you cannot get it out.
Tip number 2, if you're committed to being radically candid, one part of this, if you're addressing performance issues, is to make a list. Be really clear about what the performance issues are. So in this case, falling asleep was one of these issues. Falling asleep in meetings was one of these issues. There might be several others. Getting clear, getting specific, and being committed to sharing these with the other person. We want to acknowledge this can be hard work. Under the best of circumstances, it can be difficult, even if it's someone you do have a great relationship with. But if you've been struggling to have a good relationship with a direct report, if the performance is and has been poor since day one, and there might be some other areas of difference, whether generational, around gender, et cetera, this can be really hard. And we still owe it to this person to be clear, even if we might be afraid of them reacting poorly.
Tip number 3, look for an opportunity to be on the same team. When you leave the conversation, be really clear about how you're going to be working together collaboratively to help this person resolve the performance issue. Kim did this really expertly in our role play. It goes a long way to building trust, to be clear about how not only what the problem is, but how you are going to support the person in solving it.
Tip number 4, be really clear in your mind whether you're having a development conversation or a performance management conversation. And if you go in having a performance management conversation, ask yourself the question, have I had the development conversations? Have I told the person this and given them the opportunity to fix it before it becomes some sort of a formal process? And if you haven't, then don't have the performance conversation, have the development conversation. I think it's so important to remember that these formal processes can come in between you and your relationship. Don't let that happen.
For more tips, you can go to radicalcandor.com/resources, download our free learning guides, sign up for Radical Candor on Masterclass, get our lit video book. You can register for our workplace comedy series, The Feedback Loop, and lots more. Show notes for this episode are at radicalcandor.com/podcast. As we like to say, praise in public and private, criticize in private. If you like what you hear, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. If you have criticism for us, email it to podcast@radicalcandor.com. Special thanks again to this listener for writing in, for sharing this very challenging situation. We are supporting you and we hear all the challenges, and hopefully you heard from us the compassion that we're sending your way as you navigate this situation. Bye for now. The Radical Candor podcast is based on the book Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity by Kim Scott. Episodes are written and produced by Brandy Neal with script editing by me, Amy Sandler. The show features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff and is hosted by me, still Amy Sandler. Nick Carissimi is our audio engineer. The Radical Candor podcast theme music was composed by Cliff Goldmacher. Follow us on LinkedIn, Radical Candor the company, and visit us at radicalcandor.com.